we had last left off, Germany had invaded Poland. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, and Europe was thrown into another world war. Well, unlike the First World War, where the powers started to move very quickly and the battlefields were already strewn with dead bodies in the first couple of weeks after the war was declared, the Second World War started out strangely slowly. What occurred is that basically in the winter of 1939-1940, both sides were gearing up for war. Britain and France were basically waiting for Germany's next moves. And initially, what Germany did, and Hitler decided to do, was actually to take some northern lands. So they invaded certain areas of Scandinavia, taking over Norway initially as a attempt to have more of an access to the sea. So this was one of the first moves that Hitler made, actually, as the war started. What happened afterwards was this so-called kind of dummy war, where the Western Front was actually extremely quiet. The French were expecting a very huge mass movement of men coming through their frontiers, as had happened in the First World War. And so what they had built initially was this so-called Maginot Line. It was a line of very strong, impenetrable fortresses, which unfortunately did not work well in the Second World War. Basically, it was like using the tactics of the First World War and trying to put those onto the Second World War, and the Germans had already moved very far ahead in terms of their strategy and tactics. What the Germans did, what they depended on, was a new type of warfare that they termed as blitzkrieg, which meant lightning war. And basically what this meant was no longer utilizing the stalemate tactics of World War I. Instead, quickly rushing in with overwhelming force and military technology to take over and destroy the enemy nations. And this is exactly what happened with France in the spring of 1940. The Blitzkrieg started up, and it moved extremely quickly. Giant panzer division, tank divisions, armored cars, and dive bombers were utilized all in tandem to move the front quickly, and the French were quickly put back onto their heels. And so was the British Expeditionary Force that was on the continent helping out. The British got separated from the French, and the British basically got trapped at a port in northern France called Dunkirk. And what happened was, at their back was the English Channel, in front of them was a huge German army, and they were really trapped and had nowhere to go. And the famous story is that military boats, civilian boats, yachts, all came out and picked up as many soldiers as they could, rescuing these soldiers from Dunkirk so that they could fight another day. Many of these people were actually the Free French, too, the Frenchmen who continued to fight the Nazi power from England. Well, the Blitzkrieg quickly rolled into Paris and took Paris in the early summer of 1940, and this was a shock. Remember, the Second World War, or the First World War, of course the Germans never took Paris, and basically never got very far into the French countryside. Well, already within weeks, the German military has destroyed one of the great powers of Europe, and that is France. And basically, France now is a possession of Germany. What Germany famously does is it splits France in half. It takes the northern and eastern side of France and takes that as a part of Germany, and on the southern and farther western aspect of France, they make that into a puppet government called the Vichy government, which is run by French fascists who are friends to the Nazi cause, and sometimes by just regular French politicians who aren't necessarily friends to the Germans, and maybe not even friends to the fascists, but they feel like they have a need to take care of their French citizenry. These people were understood by the French in the after effects of the war, in the after years of the war, as really traitors to the French nation. And many of them will be persecuted. Some would be perhaps just verbally attacked. Some would be held on trial. Some would be put to death. But the case was that France losing so quickly to Germany was an absolute shock. Germany then turned to Britain, and Britain has a long history of, because of its island nature, of being separated from the continent. And in terms of of military aspects, the British have been saved because of the fact that they are an island and separated from the continent. Well, the Nazis' idea and Hitler's idea and hope was to take Britain, to make Britain fall out and use the Blitzkrieg in the exact same way. Well, of course, you couldn't use tanks, you couldn't use cars and trucks and things like that, but you could use dive bombers. And this is what the Nazis did. First, they started bombing airstrips in southern Britain, but then they started to try to terrorize the British citizenry, and they started to dive bomb and bomb London at night. This was known, of course, as the Battle of Britain. And what comes out of the Battle of Britain is a couple of things. One, it is not extremely successful. The Brits actually hardened because of what's happening instead of breaking as Hitler had hoped. And two, it allows the British Air Force to start to fight and to knock out a lot of these slow-moving bombers that the Germans are using. So it actually becomes, in many ways, at best a draw, and at worst, at best for Germany a draw, and at worst for Germany a loss. It gives the people of Britain a feeling that they are being bombarded and they need to fight. Well, Hitler turns away from Britain in 1941, seeing that he'll have to come back to that in another day. And what he turns to now is the East in the summer of 1941. Hitler has always been against Bolshevism. He despises it. Most fascist word. Hitler is no different. Hitler is extremely outspoken about the horrors of Bolshevism and how basically what he sees the Nazi movement as is an attempt to stop Bolshevism and destroy it. Well, this seems odd since they had signed a non-aggression pact with the Bolsheviks in 1939, but this was very much a political move in 1939 just to hold off on what Hitler knew would be an inevitable attack that the Nazis would put onto the Soviet Union. Well, in 1941, in so-called Operation Barbarossa, the German army, the largest army ever assembled, would attack the Soviet Union, and they would use these blitzkrieg movements. And initially, they crossed the border to the Soviet Union and were unbelievably successful. Russian armies were destroyed. Russian civilians were killed in huge numbers. Giant flows of refugees were moving off from the front and clogging up roads and making a huge mess. And it seemed that Soviet Union was going to fall quickly. The problem is the same problem that Napoleon faced. Hitler got started too late with his Operation Barbarossa. He wanted to get started in the early spring, but it got started in the late spring, early summer. And so, as he moved, Russia is so big, as he moved along, the winter set in very early in northern Russia, of course. The roads became mud. This mechanicalized warfare ground to a halt. And it allowed the Russian forces to basically start to muster. It allowed them to come together. And this attack on the Russian homeland was an opportunity for Stalin to basically get the great majority of Russians behind him. And this is what he did. He viewed and painted this as an imminent threat and extinction possibly coming from the Western and German aggressors. And so all of Russia joined together, joined forces, and this huge bear of the Russian nation started to put its force into these invading Germans. Now, once it became good enough weather again to move for Germany in 1942, they quickly started to move again, and they started to win victories again. It was just a case that though Russia had the manpower, it just did not have the tactical abilities. It did not have the weaponry that the Germans had. Well, eventually, in 1942, the Germans face off with the Russians at a city called Stalingrad. And the Germans move into Stalingrad and are trying to take Stalingrad because it's going to be the road to huge oil refineries that are to the southeast of Stalingrad. The Russians make a last-ditch effort to hold Stalingrad at all costs, and you have some of the nastiest fighting and most horrific fighting that the world has ever seen in Stalingrad. It's a siege. It is city warfare. It is a war of attrition. It is horrifying. And what occurs is finally the Russians just keep throwing men into Stalingrad, and eventually the Germans are surrounded and trapped, and a huge number of German forces, because Hitler has forced them to basically fight to the death, they have to either surrender or die in Stalingrad, and a huge number of them actually do surrender. And it's a great loss to the German military. And from that point on, the German military will be on the defensive in the east. The Russian military keeps pushing now the Germans further and further back, and the Germans need to surrender. At the same time, of course, in late 1941, the Americans get involved in the war. And of course, the Americans' main enemy is Japan, but they are also now at war with Germany. They're helping the British out. They're helping the British out in places like North Africa. And they are utilizing their great technological and industrial might to get this huge war machine in America going. Of course, that war machine is best utilized by American forces with their turning out of huge numbers of military bombers, strategic bombers, that will be utilized from British Air Force bases and that bomb German cities to a very large extent in 1942-43. Now, the Russians want the Allies in the West, the British and the Americans, to basically open a second front against the Germans in Europe, so that the Germans will have to move more troops there, and the Russians will have an easier time of it in the East. They're feeling like they're carrying the brunt of this, of the bloodshed, which they really were. Well, this is what occurs in 1943 when the American forces with British forces come up through Italy, the soft belly of the Axis powers, and will start moving up through Italy. But of course, the Italians are part of the war also, and they're fighting the Americans there, but they need the Germans' help. And then, of course, in June of 1944, the Americans open a second front in France by landing a huge amphibian landing at Normandy in places such as Omaha Beach. And this second front on so-called D-Day that opens up quickly will start to spread through France, and German forces are again forced to come over and fight American and British forces there. And at this point, it's now just a matter of time before Germany will be destroyed in this war. Unlike World War I, this is not going to be a war that will end on an armistice. Germany is obviously losing the war at this point, and the Allied powers have no intention of signing a peace treaty. This will be a war that will end with Hitler and Germany being destroyed. And that's exactly what happens. In 44-45, Germany is being enclosed by Russians to the east and Americans and British from the south and from the west. And the Russians, of course, enter German territory first and actually do take Berlin initially. And in May of 1945, Hitler, in his bunker, orders that many of his followers commit suicide, and that's exactly what he and his longtime lover, and now actually he gets married to her, and she and Hitler end up killing themselves within his bunker. Germany has fallen. It is absolutely destroyed by American bombing efforts and by the war being on its soil, unlike in World War I, where it was on French countryside more often than not. Germany is in terrible shape at the end of the war. There is no government in place, and the Allied powers will control Germany initially. However, what the Allied powers find once they come into German territory is that the Germans, during the later years of the war, were doing some of the worst atrocities that the world had ever seen to people that they understood, that the Germans understood as being racial and social undesirables. Germany had been systematically murdering people for numerous years, starting on the Eastern Front in the lands of Russia and Poland as German armies moved through, but becoming even more systemized and industrialized as the war moved on. This, of course, was the Holocaust, which we will deal with in our next lecture.